Hey guys, it's Evan with Evan K Exotic. It's Sunday, it's mid-June 2025, and I'm about ready to wrap my head wound up really well and get into water bowl changes for this collection. So just before that, I was going to shoot you a little video. And anyway, just to give you guys some updates on what's happening around, please like, comment, subscribe because I have children's pythons on the ground. I have fertile king snake eggs in the incubator, and I have several pairs of boas that are looking very positive right now. So you're going to start seeing a lot more activity as the breeding season progresses, and hopefully I'll be successful on a lot of different things this year. The other thing I'll tell you is that I'm trying to make some more of these videos that are more theoretical and deeper level understanding. They're kind of like tier 2 type videos, so they're beyond the care sheet type videos, and they're coming into the more of reptile keeping theory, and I think that stuff's really important to people that are on their second step of reptile keeping. So if you've gotten past the point of reading of having to read a care sheet like a recipe, and you want to start to understand more about reptile keeping in a holistic way like a chef rather than a recipe follower, I'm going to start making some more videos that are theoretical and things. And today's video is called The Other Reasons Your Boas and Ball Pythons Won't Eat, Masking Factors. And so this is attending to the less talked about reasons why your snakes won't eat. And what I will tell you is basically when we have the general advice for snakes and not eating is one of two things. Either it's to offer some sort of other prey or prey presentation. Offer it live, offer it pre-killed, offer it a quail, warm it, wiggle it, do something like that. So that's relying on creating different food stimuli to create a feeding response. Or the other thing that people will tell you is generally that to try to do things to promote comfort and good care in your animals. And I think that those two things are very important. But I think that people actually kind of make a little bit of a mistake, especially when they're emphasizing general comfort and good care as a reason why your snake won't feed. And the reason I think that is a bit of a misguided piece of advice or mistake is that fundamentally they are important. If your snake is not well cared for and is physically unhealthy, it's going to be less likely to eat. And fundamentally, if it's constantly stressed out, that's going to be an inhibition on it eating. So those general comfort things are important. But I think what people run into with the problem, even if they're attending to that factor, is that are the masking factors. And masking factors are the factors that are present immediately around the time of feeding that might suppress a feeding response. So from a very behavioral point of view, feeding response is something where the snake receives a stimulus, food stimulus, scent, the visual presentation, X, Y, and Z, and it responds by eating it, okay? And what a masking factor is a different stimulus suggesting a different consequence in the environment that will suppress the feeding response. So masking is a stimulus that will mask or suppress or not allow a behavior that would be elicited by a different stimulus from expressing, because that masking factor is present. So if the masking factor wasn't present, the stimulus of food would cause your animal to eat. But because this masking factor is present, even though there's a stimulus of food, your animal will not eat. So when we talk about masking factors in a lay or colloquial term, we all experience and respond to masking factors on the daily. So if you're ever in a social situation and you have an impulse to say something and then you suppress that impulse because you think that it'll be met with social judgment, that's a masking factor. The stimulus of the other people there is a masking factor because the stimulus of them there suggests that there is social judgment to be had, even though you have the stimulus that kind of creates the urge for you to say something. You suppress it because you want to, because that other stimulus is saying that that taboo or consternation is available. So if that makes sense to you. So in that situation, the stimulus that makes you want to say something is suppressed by the other factor that's there. So if you're in class and you want to blurt out a comment, but the fact that that teacher's there and the rule governing constructs are there that tell you not to blurt out in class, those are masking factors that will suppress your behavior of blurting out. We don't really call it masking when we think of it that way. The only place in society where I know that we talk about things and really call it masking is when we talk about people hiding some sort of disability. So like we can refer to like a high masking individual with autism, or a high masking person with ADHD. These are people who have these conditions, but they mask them, they suppress them. They've learned to suppress the behaviors that would be caused by those conditions because they know that they'll be socially judged. So that's just how we use masking in a colloquial social sense as a society. But what it means really in terms of feeding reptiles is two different things. It means the two masking factors I'm going to break it down to is you're a masking factor, your presence is a masking factor, and then I'm going to talk about a group of things that I consider weird feeding scenarios and how those can be masking factors. So again, remember that a masking factor is something that will suppress a behavior that would be shown if the masking factor wasn't there. And it's about those immediate local contingencies to the feeding event. So this is not talking about general care. This is not talking about generally offering 2 hides and lots of cover. Okay, this is talking about immediately in the vicinity, local, temporal, time vicinity of your feeding event, there's going to be another stimulus present that masks the feeding response that would be shown otherwise. And the first one that happens is super common, is that you are present and trying to offer that food. You can be a masking factor, and one of the strongest masking factors to an animal eating. And that's because when animals are young or poorly acclimated or not used to, I'm not saying this in you're providing negative care, but just they are not comfortable with you are basically a very large predator. And so you have to understand that when a snake eats, it's highly vulnerable for a long period of time. When a snake eats, it is risking all the risk of eating something. In the wild, they're always eating live food, and we know live food's a risk. B, while it's taking the time to engulf that food, it's completely vulnerable. Think about it this way. If an animal is eating something relatively large, for 10 to 15 minutes, it is completely occupied with consuming that. And if they're worried that something else is going to predate on them while they're consuming that, they will not eat that. It's because they are, it's because literally their mouth, their only defense mechanism, is occupied at that moment. So if there's a masking factor, they won't take the risk of eating. Similarly, once they've eaten, they are more vulnerable because they are digesting. So if there is a predatory risk present in the environment, they will not eat. And you can be perceived as a predator to your animals, and that can mask your snake's feeding behavior. The analogy I like to use is if you were at a campsite and you were about ready to bite into that burger that you grilled over the campfire. Camp food tastes so good because you're hungry. If as you're about to bite into that, a grizzly bear walked into your campsite, it doesn't matter how good that food seems, it doesn't matter how hungry you are not going to sit there and eat that cheeseburger with that grizzly bear right there, because you know that it's going to occupy your attention. You're not going to be able to focus on the threat. You know that once you eat that meal, you're not going to be able to flee the threat as much. So that's the analogy I use. You are basically a grizzly bear stuffing a cheeseburger in the snake's face, and they might say to you, hell no, I'm not going to eat a cheeseburger, you're a grizzly bear. That's the analogy I'll use. So how do you attend to that? Well, you attend to that by removing yourself from the scenario. Different ways to do that are the cupping or bagging tricks. I think you've heard me talk about that. I actually made a video called the bag trick or the cup trick. That means just simply sealing them up in a little deli cup with air holes, or sealing them up in a brown paper bag with a staple and putting them back in the cage with the dead feeder. And what that does is it keeps the animal in confrontation with the feeder, but it removes you from the scenario. Similarly, I have a couple snakes that will not eat off the tongs, but if I just put that prey on top of their hide box, I come back and 5 minutes later they've eaten it. Just simply me leaving the scenario is enough to get them to eat. Because I was a masking factor, remove the masking factor, you see the behavior, if that makes sense, the feeding behavior. So your presence is probably the biggest masking factor that you'll encounter when you're trying to get animals to start feeding. The other ones are what I call weird feeding scenarios. And basically what this means is there's a lot of factors that can go on in your room and in your cage and in the immediate time surrounding your presentation of food that will mask the feeding behaviors. And this means, like, for example, if your cage is very, very full of furnishings and whatnot, and for you to even present that prey item, you have to rustle around and remove fixtures, remove furniture. That might actually be enough commotion to throw your animal off feeding behavior. If you think about it, it's very much along the lines of tap or hook training. If you know what tap or hook training is, that's touching your animal with something that's not your hand to the point that you've turned off the feeding behavior so that they don't bite your hand. Well, if you use that knowledge in reverse, if you're doing too much commotion in the cage before you offer the food, in the same way that tap or hook training turns off the feeding response, that commotion will turn off the feeding response. That's why you will see a lot of times breeders and people that have picky feeders and things, they go down to very minimalistic cages. This is actually something that breeders and people that actually start babies understand better than the people that are giving you advice on Facebook. Is if you have a baby that's not really well eating a ton, what you really want to do is you want to create a enclosure that is minimalist and relatively small, so that you can go in and present that feeder without disturbance. If you can, that animal doesn't have anywhere to flee away from you, so you're not having to chase it with the food. All it is the real simple, clean, uneventful, chaotic presentation directly to the animal, and hopefully they feed without the masking factor of having that commotion. Okay. I see this a lot with like my children's pythons when I'm starting them, is if I have too much moss substrate in there, like having to dig down into the moss to offer the feeder to them, that's problematic. That can be a factor that gets them not to feed. Similarly, things like if you get into your room and you're flick on all the lights and you're banging around and you're playing music, and then you go over and you try to feed a snake, all that commotion surrounding the event of feeding might be a masking factor that suppresses the feeding response. Even though that snake would have fed otherwise, it won't feed because you're just hearing too much commotion. So in general, the two ways to attend to the masking factors of weird feeding scenarios is your cage design. So if you have animals that you know are picky feeders, are soft feeders, or nervous feeders, or generally flighty, you want to go minimalist in their cages. You don't want 4 inches of substrate that they can bury down and then you have to dig them up just to offer feed. You want to have a 1/2 inch of substrate in there so that they can poke their head out and you can present it right to them. You want to have a relatively small, unfurnished container for a small baby snake that's a soft feeder, because otherwise what's going to happen in a big cage that's heavily furnished, they're going to move away, and they're going to and you're going to have to chase them. That's one problem, one masking factor. Or you're going to leave that feeder on top of something or on a tray or something like that in there, and it's so far away that the space and the visual breaks of all the accessories in the cage become masking factors to suppress feeding. They'll never come back and encounter that. So the one thing you need to do is really attend through cage design, is to make it so that they are going to consistently and easily confront the feeder, and you don't have to do too much to do the presentation. And then the other thing you can do is just be aware of how you behave in the general energies you're bringing into your room around feeding. When I feed, I have a very different energy than when I'm maintaining my room. So if I'm maintaining my room, I come in, I turn in all my lights, I spend 15-20 minutes getting set up. I'm not worried about being quiet. I put on the podcast. That's actually something that would be a masking factor during my feeding events. But because I'm going to go in and maintain the animals, it's not important. And it's not like it turns them off long term, because remember, this is very local to the feeding event. The fact that I'm creating commotion in my room right now doesn't suppress their feeding response a day from now, just like tap training my snake today doesn't suppress their feeding response tomorrow. So what it actually does is it's another layer of protection against bites in this room, is when I change my energy, when I'm maintaining this room. It's just a very different energy in the room when I'm maintaining my animals than when I'm feeding my animals. Whereas when I'm feeding my animals, I will come in, I'll turn on the one overhead light on the far corner, so it's not like the whole room is blasting, it's just enough for me to see. I will come in, I will have everything already laid out, and I'll come in and boom, 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 boom. I will quietly, quickly, and efficiently come through and feed this collection in about 15 minutes. So that's just another way you can attend to that that secondary masking factor about the weird fooding scenario. So I hope that all makes sense to you, and I hope that you guys can start to see how that might get put into play in your collection, or when you are trying to get babies started and whatnot. So that's just something that I'll tell you. This is information that I'll tell you is coming from experience. Having started babies is different than the advice I would have given you before I started babies, if that makes sense. And I'll tell you that it probably has more value to you than somebody telling you why your snake won't eat and then telling you to fill your cage full of cover and hides and all that stuff in X, Y, and Z. Because even though that stuff is not a bad idea, it's not attending to the immediate contingencies around feeding that will suppress your feeding behavior. So, hope that all makes sense to you. Take care. Have a great day. Bye bye.